Hi, my name's Andy Schmuckler, and I'm going to be talking in this video about why the Confederacy was nothing to celebrate, is nothing to celebrate, if you want to think about it that way. Well, let me start by telling you what enables me to speak about this. I, by 20 couple years ago, I had more than a little background in American history, but I wasn't an American historian. But I spent a couple of years teaching American history to very bright juniors in secondary school. And I got interested in the emergence, how the Civil War came about. I mean, people spend a lot of time looking at the battles, and that is really very interesting stuff. Grant at Vicksburg and Lee getting defeated at Gettysburg. All that's, but to understand the real human issues involved, much better to pay attention to the 1850s and some of the 1840s too. I mean, the issue of slavery was it was everything in the American political system for quite a long while, and every other decision seemed to I mean, the government could hardly do anything without that being the issue. Like, where are we going to have the Continental Railroad? And let me adjust this thing a little bit. Even that got to be, tied up in the whole sectional conflict issue, which was basically an issue over slavery. That was the whole thing. And the process by which we went from being a nation that was coping fairly well with the issues it needed to cope with, to one that broke down into a catastrophic civil war from which we still haven't recovered fully. It was very interesting to study, which I did, and I was especially motivated to when I saw that what happened in the 1850s and what's been happening in our time. This was back a ways, from 2004 to up until the rise of Trump, I would say. I was very interested in seeing the ways in which the dynamics of the 1850s showed a continuity with what was erupting into the American political system of these times, which was my real preoccupation. So I read a couple dozen books about how the Civil War came to be. My favorite of which is The Impending Crisis. There's a Civil War era book by that title, but the more historical analysis was a book in the early 1970s by a guy named Stephen Potter, I think, but he died in the process, and one of his friends, who was a great historian as well, finished the book, and I just found that book, stunning. The drama of how this country fell apart. So anyway, that's who I am. At least it's the most relevant part of who I am, and why I say that the two pieces to why the Confederacy is nothing to celebrate. And let me also just say that I'm sitting here in within the boundaries of the Confederacy. Off to my side there, to the west, is Great North Mountain, and along the top of it runs the border between Virginia and West Virginia, which means I'm in the eastern side of that border, and that means I'm in Virginia, which was in some ways, the heart of the Confederacy. It produced Lee. It had the capital of the Confederacy. It wasn't the most rabid. I mean, that's South Carolina. But when I drive here off the interstate, it's a 20-minute drive. I'm likely to pass uh, several houses with flying the Confederate flag. Uh, so I, I sit here in the Confederacy, and I'm aware of the place that the Confederacy holds in the minds uh, of the people. Um, the when the people in my county started the school board um, said that they were going to actually effected it made a change in the names of the schools because everything around here is named after Confederate generals. Uh, so the high school that a kid living here would attend was called Stonewall Jackson High School. And the school board changed the name to something like Mountain View. That was the name of my rival high school, and I was a high school player in Minnesota. But anyway, I think that's what the title is. Anyway, there are a bunch of names that have been changed, and the reaction of the population here was just dynamite. I mean, they overthrew the school board. Somebody my wife's friend with, who was a real great and dedicated educator, was I think chair of the school board or something like that. Anyway, she retired. I mean, she just couldn't take the abuse. So I know a little bit from living here. Also, I did talk radio here from 1992 to 2002, talking to um, mostly conservative callers, and several major times the topic of the day bore upon the issues having to do with the Civil War. And so I was, a Yankee, not a Yankee in King Arthur's court like in the Mark Twain novel, but a Yankee in Confederate Shenandoah Valley, which was called the breadbasket of the Confederacy, and which was put to the torch by Union General Sheridan, I think was his name. So anyway, there's history here, and I would discuss with people various things that came up during the 1990s that touched upon this. You know, various issues that would arise. You know, like the flag in South Carolina at the state capitol. I think that was an issue that came up then. Anyway, so here's what I think that should be known about the Confederacy. First, their decision to secede and their effecting that secession and their defending their seceding from the Union with an army waging war was a crime. You know, the argument I'm about to put forward is one I've never encountered anywhere. So I've read a couple dozen books, but so I do wonder, maybe it's out there. I don't see anything, any holes in this case, but it makes me wonder, well, if it is true, then why isn't this get stressed in these books? Maybe it is, but here's the deal. We, with the Constitution, agree to settle our differences through the rule of law. There are conflicts, and these conflicts are dealt with in the courts, not on the battlefield. That's a truly crucial component, that fundamental to the whole concept of a constitution, like our framers had in mind. So there is a question about whether the South had a right to secede. The South believed that it did, and the idea that it did had a long pedigree in the South. That doesn't prove that it's true that they have a right to secede. But that idea, I think, surfaced in the 1830s and certainly during the 1850s. The South simply assumed that they had that right. But a citizen doesn't have the right to simply assert that they've got the right. Whether they've got the right or not has to be determined through the rule of law. And in this case, Abraham Lincoln had been elected President of the United States, which carries with it a great deal of authority in constitutional matters. He has actually taken an oath to make sure that the Constitution is protected and defended and preserved. And he took the position, which he argued very well, that the states did not have the right to secede. He was a very good lawyer, and he was so good that arguments that he put forward when he was becoming a national figure made him really something political to contend with. And he had only been a one-term congressman from 1848 to 1850 or something like that. And then he had stepped down because of some agreement and only came back into politics in 1854. And he was in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois and became a national figure then. But again, it was because he made such powerful arguments. And he made the argument that the South did not have the right to secede. And I've seen that argument. I couldn't recap it here to my satisfaction, but it doesn't matter what the argument was. The President of the United States said, you can't secede. Under the rule of law, which all of us are part of a pact to honor, the South was not the decider about that issue. It was just one of the contenders that takes the issue to court, where the authorities that the Constitution sets up to decide such an issue will make the determination. They did not take the issue to the Supreme Court. By the way, if I had been on the Supreme Court and 1860, the South files suit to dissolve the Union and asserts their right to form a new country under a new framework. If I had been on the Supreme Court, I might well have sympathized with their argument. I've noticed as I've observed myself watching secessionist kinds of movements that I tend to be sympathetic with those who want to secede. I mean, for example, the Scottish Nationalist Party that wants to become a separate from the UK. Now, right now, they're under a cloud of some scandal. I don't think we're going to hear anything more about Scottish national independence till that smell dissipates. But I felt sympathetic. I mean, even without their Brexit was a disaster, and the Scots didn't want it at all, so that was an additional reason. But I was, even before that, I was sympathetic. And when the Czechs and the Slovaks separated peacefully, I felt, okay, they got a right to, the Slovaks didn't want to be under the domination anymore of the Czechs. Okay, self-determination of peoples is a basic American value. And I also have felt some sympathy with the Catalans in Spain. So I mean, I won't go into why I do, but self-determination is part of it. And I know that a lot of nations have been formed by force. A lot of people have been compelled to be part of a larger nation while feeling like they were something separate, and but not being allowed to be separate. You know, that's how most of the nations of Europe were formed. One part of it compelled the other parts of it to submit themselves to their will. It's not a pretty process. Right? Now we've got these nation states, and everybody's, you know, it's been many, many generations, but there's a lot of wounding that takes place in that. You know, maybe I think that's my fundamental reason. I mean, I'll talk about what the South represented in a minute, but you know, I wouldn't have been sympathetic with that. I mean, it was basically about white supremacy and the right of whites to make slaves out of blacks. And I hate that. I've always hated that. I find it terribly ugly. But there's also a level at which, you know, if I'm on the Supreme Court, I don't necessarily feel like I'm entitled to judge whether an institution, which the Constitution itself acknowledged the existence of, didn't forbid. And Lincoln was clear that he didn't have the constitutional right to eliminate slavery where it already existed, because that was protected by the Constitution. But he did feel like he had the right, and he was willing to assert it to prevent it expanding further. And that's what all the battles have been about, was the expansion of slavery. That was what the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was about. That was what the Compromise of 1850 was about. That was what the Kansas-Nebraska Act was about. That was what the Dred Scott decision was about. So Lincoln was the enemy of the expansion of the slave power into new territory. He was a guy who would stand in the way of the slave power. And now we get to the second reason that the South is nothing to celebrate. Not only did the slave power act lawlessly in precipitating a civil war rather than asserting their interpretation of the Constitution in a legal process which would allow the Supreme Court to say whether or not they had the right to secede. In addition to that, there's something of the same ugly spirit of, I will not submit myself to anything, but rather assert my domination, in what the Confederacy was about. And it was quite clear what the Confederacy was about. The whole region of the South had been formed on the basis of an economic system in which white people had the right to enslave black people. The Dred Scott decision said, the black man has no rights the white man is obliged to respect. That was the essence of the Confederacy. There is a very famous speech delivered by one of the best men of the Confederacy. It's called the Cornerstone Speech. The guy was Alexander Stephens. He was from Georgia, I think, and he was a senator, and he became the vice president of the Confederacy. And he delivered a speech which was famous because it was considered such a fine statement about this new government that they were establishing, the Confederate States of the Confederate States of America. And he declares the essence of it to be this great moral principle that the white man is superior to the black man, and that being the property, the slave labor of the white man is the natural condition uh, uh, of the black man. And he represents this not as a confession, it's not a critique. It's not like Thomas Jefferson talking about the corrupting effects of on the master of having slaves. No, this is a proud statement at the very beginnings of all this movement at the Civil War about the noble principle that the Confederacy represents. It's a pretty ugly principle. One group of people asserting their superiority over another, asserting that that other has no rights, that the other has to respect. I mean, this is one of the ugly things that's threaded through the history of civilization. I mean, the blacks of the South aren't the first slaves that the human world has shown, but it's always been a blight. Maybe they build for the powerful, great pyramids to be their tombs, but it's a hell of a way to treat other human beings. Pretty ugly. It's based on domination. And it generates it reflects a pattern of a sort of a pathology around the question of domination and subordination. You've got a class of people whose wealth and power is based on their owning other human beings, a kind of human livestock. What does that require of people? Well, like I said, Jefferson, he wrote eloquently about the terrible effects on the character. And he was a slave owner. Interesting man, how he couldn't, it seems to me like he couldn't curtail his desire for what slavery provided for him, the wealth that, I mean, he couldn't live within his means as it was. But anyway, he believed in certain things, and he looked at a lot of things square in the eye. And when he said all men are created equal, I bet you that he deep down included the blacks. But anyway, the cornerstone speech that Stevens delivered, he puts that in directly in the framework of critiquing the idea that all men are created equal. He's explicit about saying that's exactly the problem, that false belief. Not all men are created equal. So, if you look at the moral spirit that imbues Western civilization, I see the better core of Christianity reflected in the idea that all men are created equal. Like we're all equal in the sight of God, I think is an idea that works its way through the centuries, that feeds directly into Thomas Jefferson writing those lines in the Declaration of Independence. So this guy, Stevens, founds, if that is a beautiful Christian idea, and I think it is, love thy neighbor as thyself. And he chose the outgroup, the people that were despised, the Samaritans, to illustrate what he meant by our neighbor. If that's the good, then clearly the alternative, the opposite, we are superior to them and have the right to do whatever we want with them, to use them for our purposes. I think that's quite obviously a component of what we might regard as evil in the human world. So when my neighbors around here are celebrating the Confederacy, it's often in a spirit of defiance. But it's not a defiance which is about the value of liberty. It's a defiance in the refusal to submit to what one has an obligation to submit to, whether it's taking the case to the Supreme Court, remind me to talk about how much the South dominated this country in its early generations. To submit to the results of an election in 1860. And isn't it interesting the way the same thing has been happening in our time? Just like the South wouldn't accept, we are not going to be subordinated to this person who won the election fair and square, but we regard as an enemy. Well, that's not the agreement. That's lawless. We agree to abide by the results of an election. They didn't in the South, and Trump world has not this time. Interesting recapitulation of ugly piece of history. The refusal to subordinate. And that correlates with the whole infatuation with the source of their power, which is the slave system. If subordinating oneself has overtones of putting yourself in the position of what you do to the blacks, that's a pretty scary thing. The whole issue of domination and subordination, meaning, am I willing to respect an authority over me? Not if the idea of subordination and the idea of slavery are sort of confounded in one's mind. And that's how the South often talked in the lead up to the Civil War. They saw every infringement on their power as threatening to make slaves out of them. So there's a kind of dynamic within the person, it seems, that's really kind of ugly and broken. Either I'm going to treat the other cruelly, or I'm afraid of if I subordinate myself, I will be the victim. And, don't you see that in Trump? I mean, he had this abusive father, and now he abuses everybody around him. It's, the human relationships are reduced to a dynamic in which we either treat with each other with mutual respect and mutual regard and loving our neighbors as ourselves and all the things that define the good, or we do the opposite. And what is the opposite of good? It's what the slave power represented. So my neighbors have been sold a big bill of goods, in a different sense of the word good, about the noble cause of the Confederacy. There's nothing noble about it. It was a handful of people who got their wealth and power, who had been a class that had dominated the region to an extent that nobody in the North actually dominated their region until the end of the 19th century, during the age of the robber barons. Much more equal society. But this was a very unequal society where the few plantation owners called the shots. And they hadn't had to learn to be able to play by the rules and accept that we're in this together, partly also because the Constitution was set up in such a way that they exercised an inordinate amount of power from the time of the founding until the Civil War. They didn't have a lot of experience living under the rule of somebody like Lincoln. I mean, I have had to live under presidencies that Trump, but also in the case of Nixon, I was pretty upset. In the case of Reagan, there was a lot that upset me. Though I was happy with what he did with Gorbachev at the end, but there was a time when I thought he was driving us to a nuclear war. It's not fun to live under a president that doesn't agree with you. But if you look at the record, and somebody, people have, the number of presidents that came from slave states was way disproportionate. The number of speakers of the House that came from slave states was way disproportionate. The number of justices on the Supreme Court that came from slave states was way disproportionate. And even when a president came from a non-slave state, like Buchanan comes from Pennsylvania, election of 1856, he was such he appeased the South in so many ways, and worse than appeased. I mean, the South basically dominated the country. And I'm not saying that they did necessarily a bad job. I mean, Jefferson and Washington and I don't know what I think of Jackson, but Madison, Monroe, I mean, they did a respectable job. The aristocrats of the South were in many ways a finer lot than their equivalent now on the same kind of power that's risen on the right. I mean, they were in many ways gentlemen. Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump, Tom DeLay, these are not gentlemen. But Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all Virginians, they were gentlemen. So the South generated a kind of a pathology because they were built on something essentially broken, or I would say evil. And it generated a ruling small group that really called the plays for the whole region, as I said, to a much greater degree than in, say, Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania. And this small group was able to manipulate the non-slave holding whites in the region. That's what you get when you're as dominant as they are. You get to shape the culture to a disproportionate degree. And they were able to, with their power and their wealth, over the course of the generations from the first slavery on this continent in Virginia, 16, around the time of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, something like that. And anyways, before this became the United States, more than a century and a half went by with the slave system developing. And this dominant group gets to shape a whole lot of what develops. And part of what they develop is a population, a culture in which the many get manipulated by the few. The rich man and the rich white man and the poor white man. There's a whole chapter of that on a book called The Killers of the Dream by a psychoanalytically inclined Mississippi girl who was born in the 1890s. She was talking about the Jim Crow South and the con game by which we see going on right in our times, when all these people are supporting a political power that's just exploiting them, does nothing to make their lives better. Well, that developed in the slave region for generations, even before we were the United States. A culture in which a few are able to can have a strange effect on the minds of the many. And I'll just close by saying one of the things that this culture was able to accomplish, which is really kind of impressive in a dark and ugly way, this slave power drove the region into a civil war that was absolutely disastrous. I mean, it was a huge catastrophe for the region. All the men that were killed, the infrastructure that was laid waste, the trauma, the impoverishment, all the men who had been in the army who go out to the West to live their wild ways. It was a huge blow to the region. You would think that that leadership that drove the region into an absolute disaster would be regarded as with contempt and be in disgrace and hated. Look what you did to this region, but no. Before the war, this culture was able to take the ancestors of my neighbors and get them to think that their honor was at stake in preserving the growing empire of the slave power. If anybody criticized it or sought to limit it, that was an affront to the honor of the South. So people were manipulated into thinking they had a positive stake in defending the slave power, which actually was much to their detriment. When the Irish came to these shores, they went to the north. They didn't want to compete against slave power. But the ancestors of the people of the whites of the Confederacy did have to compete against slave power, which is why they were poorer. Free labor drives the price down. But they felt willing to charge up Cemetery Hill at Gettysburg and get mowed down to defend the slave power. That's pretty impressive propaganda. And then after the Civil War, that same cultural power system reassembles itself, resubjugates the blacks, not as slaves like before, but essentially the same, and remanipulates the whites into thinking that the Confederacy was something to celebrate. Imagine all that they had been through and all the price that they had paid for it. And the powers that be in the region were able to sell them the idea that they should be naming highways after Jefferson Davis. Good grief. The human world has a force of brokenness that operates in it. I mean, that's taking things to a different level, but we can see that there are a lot of ways in which it manifests itself, that this integrated picture of things sort of puts together. There's a problem in the human world, and it gets played out as things get passed along, like a certain kind of ugly power that manipulates people in certain ways and leads people to do things which are contrary to their interests, but continue to feed a destructive power and the people who are channeling it. Well, in 2014, I wrote a piece that the spirit that drove us to civil war is back. I suggest you Google, if you're interested, you Google Schmuckler, my name, and the spirit that drove us to civil war is back, or some piece of that, because I think it's on my website, actually. I draw a lot of parallels. I actually think that the proper way to understand the meaning of those parallels between what rose in the South that drove us to civil war, the 1850s and before, and what has risen on the American right through the 1990s and the Bush presidencies and what was developing further under the Obama presidency and then manifested itself in the Trump presidency. I think that it's not just like coincidence, and it's not just, oh, these things all look alike, but if you trace how things moved through time in the American culture from, say, 1830 something, when the South is beginning to ban uh, abolitionist literature going through the U.S. mail, all the way to the rise of the uh, uh, the denialist movement when Obama was president, that sold the idea that he was not qualified to be president because he was born in Kenya, even though there was a birth announcement in the Hawaiian papers in 1961. Nonetheless, people somehow believing the unbelievable. If you look at how all that moves through time, I think what you see is that there was um, a coherent force that worked through cause and effect, that you can see moving in a certain way through time over the generations. The Ku Klux Klan, and even up into Trump's father marching in the Ku Klux Klan march. I mean, it's just an enormously complex thing, but you can see this thing moving through time. I think that what rose on the Republican side from the beginnings with Newt Gingrich, uh, and then Fox News, and all the stuff, and the Koch brothers, that you can actually see, and the the same, like a weather system, like looking at a hurricane, how it spins. It's the same thing, even as it changes shape slightly, moving through time. Anyway, that's I'll talk about how we can see something like a coherent force operating in the human world. Very important, I think. But I'm just pointing in that direction now. And I'll also just say that when Trump came in, uh, I think he introduced some different dimensions than the spirit that drove us to civil war. He comes out of a slightly different world and gave a different twist to it, but it's all still there. It's all coming together. But it was clearer in 2014 when I wrote that piece that I encourage you to look at. The spirit that drove us to civil war is back. And as I said in another video I did earlier today here about um, the coming showdown over the 2024 election. The concept of we're having another civil war, though in a different form, I think is useful for understanding the drama of these times. Well, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.